If you asked someone in London or New York or Sydney what the most advanced country in Asia looks like on the inside, they would probably describe something futuristic. Robotic hotel staff, bullet trains, vending machines that sell everything from hot ramen to fresh flowers. And they would be right about all of that. Japan is one of the most technologically sophisticated nations on the planet, with a gross domestic product that has ranked among the top 5 economies in the world for decades. They had high-speed rail in 1964, half a century before most countries even started planning theirs. They build toilets with more computing power than the first space shuttle. And yet, every single night, tens of millions of Japanese people walk into their homes, pull a thin cotton mattress out of a closet, lay it flat on the floor, and go to sleep. Without a bed frame, without a box spring, without so much as a headboard, just a body on a mat, inches from the ground. What nobody knew, at least in the West, was that this wasn't some relic of poverty or a quirk that Japan just hadn't gotten around to fixing. This was a deliberate, engineered, deeply intentional choice, and the reasons behind it stretch back over 1,000 years. If you'd asked anyone in Kyoto about sleeping habits back in the 8th century, during the Nara period, they would have told you that everyone slept on the floor. They had no idea that 1,000 years later, the rest of the world would find this strange. Back then, the floor was where life happened. People ate on the floor. They meditated on the floor. They held court and made political decisions while sitting on woven mats spread across wooden planks. Sleeping on the floor wasn't unusual because everything happened on the floor. But the floor itself was the innovation. Japanese craftspeople had developed tatami, mats woven from a grass called igusa, a type of rush that grew in the wetlands of southern Japan. These mats were roughly 2 inches thick, firm enough to support a body, but soft enough to sit on for hours. They had a clean, grassy smell that faded over months into something warm and woody, and they did something remarkable with moisture. Igusa fibers could absorb and release humidity naturally, pulling dampness from the air during Japan's brutal summers and releasing it slowly during the drier winter months. During the Heian period, which lasted from the late 8th century to the late 12th century, these tatami mats became status symbols. Only the aristocracy could afford to cover entire rooms with them. Everyone else had bare wooden floors or packed earth with a single mat to sit on. The futon, which in those early days was little more than a thin padded quilt, was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Ordinary people slept on straw or directly on the wood with nothing but a robe for warmth. This is where Zen Buddhism enters the picture, and it changes everything. Zen monks who traveled between China and Japan during this period brought back a philosophy that prized simplicity above all else. Owning less wasn't a sign of poverty. It was a sign of spiritual clarity. The monks slept on thin mats in bare rooms, ate simple meals from wooden bowls, and spent hours in seated meditation on those same floors where they slept. Sleep was not something to be indulged. It was a necessary pause between periods of discipline and awareness. That monastic minimalism filtered into Japanese aristocratic culture and then into the general population over the next several centuries. The idea of accumulating large, heavy furniture, of filling a room with objects, started to feel not just unnecessary but almost spiritually cluttered. A room with a futon that could be folded and stored in a closet by morning was a room that could become anything. A bedroom at night, a tea room in the morning, a workspace by afternoon. This detail, the folding and storing of the futon, would later become one of the strongest reasons the practice survived into modern Japan. But that is getting ahead of the story, because there was another group of people who took floor sleeping and turned it into something far more intense: the samurai. From the 12th century onward, as Japan entered its feudal era under the rule of military warlords, the samurai warrior class dominated Japanese society for nearly 700 years. And the samurai did not sleep in beds. They slept on the floor, often on nothing more than a thin mat with a wooden or ceramic pillow, fully dressed in lightweight clothing that could be swapped quickly for armor. This was not about comfort. This was about survival. A samurai sleeping on a raised platform was a samurai who took an extra 2 or 3 seconds to get on his feet during an ambush. In an era where nighttime raids on rival clans were common, those seconds could mean the difference between drawing a sword and taking a blade to the neck. Sleeping low to the ground meant the body was already close to a fighting stance. One motion to roll, one motion to rise. The wooden pillow, called a makura, was designed to keep the samurai's top-knot hairstyle intact, while also ensuring he slept lightly. You don't fall into deep, comfortable sleep with your head resting on a carved block of paulownia wood. And that was the point. Deep sleep was dangerous. Light sleep kept you alive. And somehow, this military discipline didn't stay confined to the battlefield. Over centuries, as the samurai class became not just warriors but also administrators, scholars, and cultural leaders, their habits became the cultural standard. Sleeping low was associated with readiness, with discipline, with a kind of quiet toughness that ordinary Japanese citizens admired and emulated. There is a famous account from the Edo period, when Japan entered over 250 years of relative peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, beginning in 1603. Even during this long stretch without major warfare, samurai households maintained the tradition of sleeping on the floor. Fathers taught their sons, mothers taught their daughters. The practice had long since stopped being about dodging sword attacks in the night. It had become something deeper, a marker of character. Sleeping on a soft, elevated surface was seen as indulgent, almost weak. The floor was honest. It didn't pamper you. And that association between austerity and moral strength became embedded in Japanese culture so deeply that it outlasted the samurai class itself by centuries. The futon on the floor stopped being a soldier's compromise and became a cultural identity. And if that were the only reason the practice endured, it might have eventually faded. But Japan's geography had other plans. There is a detail about Japan's physical landscape that most people outside of Asia dramatically underestimate, and it explains more about Japanese architecture and daily life than almost anything else. Japan sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. The archipelago straddles 4 tectonic plates. The country experiences roughly 1,500 earthquakes per year that are strong enough to be felt by humans, and somewhere around 5,000 total seismic events annually when you count the ones only instruments can detect. That is not a typo, by the way. 5,000 earthquakes a year. This geological reality shaped every single aspect of how Japanese people built their homes. Traditional Japanese houses were constructed almost entirely from wood and paper. Sliding shoji screens made from translucent washi paper, fusuma panels that could be removed to reshape rooms entirely, wooden frames designed to flex and sway during tremors rather than resist and crack like stone or brick. And here is the critical connection. In a country where buildings are designed to move, heavy furniture becomes a weapon. A 400-pound oak wardrobe is fine in a house that never shakes. In a Japanese home during a magnitude 6 earthquake, that wardrobe becomes a projectile. Elevated beds with thick headboards and heavy frames are the same problem on a smaller scale. Something that weighs 200 pounds, standing 3 feet off the ground, toppling onto a sleeping person during a midnight quake is a serious injury waiting to happen. A futon on the floor weighs maybe 15 pounds. It cannot fall on you. It cannot pin you. When the shaking starts, you are already on the ground. You roll off the futon, cover your head, and you are in the safest position a human body can occupy during an earthquake. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 destroyed most of Tokyo and Yokohama, killed over 100,000 people, and triggered firestorms that burned for days across the city's wooden neighborhoods. The earthquake was a magnitude 7.9, and it happened just before noon, when cooking fires were lit across thousands of homes. The devastation reshaped Japanese urban planning for the next century. Someone specific saw a pattern in the aftermath and said something that stuck. Architects and city planners studying the destruction noted that the heaviest casualties inside homes came from falling structures and heavy objects crushing occupants. The lightest, most portable furnishings caused the fewest injuries. Homes with minimal furniture, with futons stored in closets and tatami on the floor, gave their occupants the best chance of survival. Nobody listened at the scale they should have, not right away. But the data was there. And over time, it reinforced what the culture had already been practicing for centuries. And that practice centered on the tatami room. In a traditional Japanese home, and in millions of modern Japanese apartments, there is at least one tatami room. This room is the most versatile space in the house. During the day, the futon is folded into thirds and stored inside a built-in closet called an oshiya. The room becomes an open space for eating, working, studying, or entertaining. At night, the futon comes back out, and the same room becomes a bedroom. This is not a compromise. This is a design philosophy. And it works, because Japanese living spaces have been small for a very long time. The average apartment in central Tokyo measures between 300 and 500 square feet. That is roughly the size of a single-car garage in many American suburbs. In that kind of space, dedicating an entire room permanently to a bed that nobody uses for 16 hours a day is an extraordinary waste of square footage. The futon solves this perfectly. A queen-sized futon, folded and stored, takes up about 6 cubic feet of closet space. An equivalent Western bed with a frame, mattress, box spring, and headboard takes up roughly 48 square feet of permanent floor space. In a 400 square foot apartment, that is 12% of your entire home locked into a single piece of furniture. Japanese families understood this math intuitively, long before anyone put numbers to it. The daily ritual of folding the futon became so embedded in Japanese life that it is taught to children from the age of 3 or 4 as one of their first household responsibilities. You wake up, you fold your futon, you store it. Your bedroom becomes your living room. This is not a chore, it is a transition. It marks the shift from sleep to waking life, from rest to action. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains something that most Westerners miss entirely about Japanese domestic life. The futon is not just a mattress. The act of folding and unfolding the futon is a daily ritual that structures time and creates intentionality around the space where you live. The room is never just one thing. It is whatever you need it to be, and you are the one who decides every morning and every night. Now, there is a climate dimension to all of this that often gets overlooked. Japan stretches from subarctic Hokkaido in the north to subtropical Okinawa in the south, but the majority of the population lives in the humid subtropical zone. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Fukuoka. Summers in these cities are brutally hot, with temperatures regularly climbing past 35 degrees Celsius and humidity that can hover above 90% for weeks at a time. Heat rises. This is basic physics that every schoolchild learns, but it has profound implications for how people sleep. In a room where the air temperature at ceiling height might be 32 degrees Celsius, the air at floor level could be 3 or 4 degrees cooler. That does not sound like much, but anyone who has tried to sleep in humid heat knows that even 2 degrees can mean the difference between restless tossing and actually falling asleep. Tatami mats amplify this effect. The Igusa rush grass is naturally cool to the touch, and its moisture-absorbing properties mean that the surface does not develop that sticky, clammy feeling that vinyl, leather, or even cotton sheets develop in high humidity. Sleeping on a futon laid on tatami in a Japanese summer is genuinely more comfortable than sleeping on an elevated mattress in the same room. The floor is cooler, the mat is drier, and the body stays closer to the most comfortable air in the room. In winter, the solution was equally floor-based. The kotatsu, a low wooden table fitted with an electric heater underneath and draped with a heavy blanket, became the center of family life during the cold months. Family members would sit on the floor around the kotatsu, with their legs tucked under the blanket, eating dinner, doing homework, watching television, all while staying warm from the waist down. At bedtime, heavier futons called kakebuton were layered on top of the sleeper, sometimes 3 or 4 deep during the coldest weeks. Some families placed a small electric blanket beneath the shikibuton for additional warmth. The point is that every season had its floor-level solution. Summer favored the floor because heat rises. Winter favored the floor because the heating systems were designed for it. Japanese homes, especially traditional ones, were not built with central heating the way Western homes were. Instead of trying to heat the entire volume of a room from floor to ceiling, the Japanese approach targeted the body directly. Heat the space where the person actually is, not the empty air above their head. This seasonal adaptability was a warning sign for anyone who thought Western beds could replace futons. The whole Japanese domestic ecosystem, from architecture to furniture to heating to daily routine, was built around floor-level living. Swapping in a bed was not just changing one piece of furniture, it was fighting against an entire system. The same design philosophy that made Japanese homes so well adapted to floor sleeping was about to be tested. By the mid-20th century, something happened that should have ended floor sleeping in Japan permanently. After World War II, American occupation forces flooded Japan with Western culture. American movies, American music, American fashion, and American furniture. Department stores in Tokyo and Osaka started displaying Western-style beds with thick spring mattresses, ornate headboards, and matching bedroom sets. For a generation of Japanese consumers eager to modernize, the Western bed symbolized progress. It was aspirational, it was new, and many Japanese families tried them. Beds appeared in Japanese homes throughout the 1950s and 60s, especially in newer, Western-style apartment buildings that were replacing traditional wooden houses. For a while, it seemed like the futon might fade into history, the way so many other traditional practices did during Japan's rapid post-war modernization. But something unexpected happened. People missed their futons. The beds were too soft. Japanese sleepers accustomed to firm tatami surfaces found Western spring mattresses uncomfortable and complained of back pain. The beds took up too much space in already tiny apartments. They could not be moved or stored, which meant the bedroom could never become anything else. And in a country where earthquakes remained a constant reality, heavy bed frames rattling and sliding across the floor during tremors reminded people exactly why their grandparents had slept low to the ground in the first place. By the 1980s, surveys showed that the majority of Japanese households still used futons as their primary sleeping arrangement, despite having the economic means to buy any bed on the market. This was not about cost. A high-quality shikibuton from a respected maker like Nishikawa, a company that has been producing bedding since 16566, could cost the equivalent of several $100s. Japanese consumers were choosing futons deliberately, with full knowledge of the alternative. The generational divide is real, though. Younger Japanese adults, especially those living in modern apartments without tatami rooms, are more likely to own Western-style beds. Some newer Tokyo apartments are built entirely with hardwood or vinyl flooring, which makes futon sleeping less appealing because these surfaces lack the natural cushioning and moisture regulation that tatami provides. Futon makers have responded by developing thicker, more heavily padded shikibutons designed specifically for use on hard floors rather than tatami. But even with this generational shift, the numbers remain remarkable. Surveys consistently show that roughly half of all Japanese adults sleep on futons on the floor, with the percentage climbing higher among older generations and in rural areas. In a country with the third largest economy in the world, with access to every luxury product ever manufactured, tens of millions of people actively prefer sleeping on the floor. Now, the health angle is where this gets really interesting, because it is the part that has started pulling attention from the rest of the world. Proponents of floor sleeping point to spinal alignment. The argument is straightforward. A firm, flat surface forces the spine into its natural curvature, rather than allowing it to sag into the shaped dip that soft mattresses create. When you sleep on a firm surface, your body weight distributes more evenly, reducing pressure points and allowing muscles to relax rather than compensate for an uneven surface. Orthopedic specialists are divided on this. Some Western doctors have started recommending firmer sleeping surfaces for patients with chronic lower back pain, citing studies that show improvement on medium firm to firm surfaces compared to soft ones. Others argue that the ideal surface depends entirely on the individual's body weight, sleeping position, and existing spinal conditions. What is harder to argue with is the longevity data. Japan consistently ranks among the top 3 countries in the world for life expectancy, with an average that hovers around 84 years. Japanese women live longer than women in any other country. While nobody is claiming that floor sleeping alone explains this, the Japanese approach to daily life, which includes floor sleeping, regular low-level physical activity from sitting and rising from the floor, and a generally minimalist approach to material possessions, correlates with lower rates of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and musculoskeletal problems compared to Western nations. The simple act of getting down to the floor and rising from the floor every single day is itself a form of exercise that most Westerners eliminate from their lives entirely once they have a bed. A Brazilian study published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology tested over 2,000 adults between the ages of 51 and 80 on their ability to sit down on the floor and stand back up without using their backs, hands, knees, or other support. The researchers tracked participants for an average of 6 years and found that those who struggled with this basic movement had a significantly higher mortality rate than those who could do it easily. Japanese people who sleep on futons perform this exact movement at least twice a day, every day, for their entire lives. By the time a Japanese person reaches the age of 70, they have gotten down to the floor and risen from it roughly 50,000 times just for sleep alone. That does not count meals eaten at low tables, time spent on floor cushions, or tea ceremonies conducted entirely at ground level. The cumulative effect on joint mobility, leg strength, and balance is not trivial. It is a lifetime of low-intensity training disguised as daily routine. You would think someone would have noticed this earlier. Nobody did, at least not in the mainstream, until the global wellness movement caught up. While all of this was happening in Japan, something else was brewing in the West. Marie Kondo's book, published in English in 2014, introduced millions of Western readers to the Japanese concept of keeping only what sparks joy and letting go of everything else. The book sold over 13 million copies worldwide, and suddenly, Western consumers were looking at their overstuffed bedrooms with fresh eyes. Minimalism had been growing as a Western movement for years, but Kondo gave it a Japanese framework that felt more authentic and more actionable than the vague own less stuff advice that Western minimalists had been offering. And one of the most visible symbols of that Japanese minimalism was the futon on the floor. Western minimalists started experimenting with floor sleeping, posting about it on social media, and discovering what Japanese people had known for over 1,000 years. You do not need a $2,000 mattress to sleep well. You might actually sleep better without one. The irony is thick enough to sleep on. The West spent decades exporting beds to Japan, and now a growing number of Westerners are importing futons from Japan. Specialty futon retailers have opened in cities like Los Angeles, Portland, and London, selling authentic Japanese shikibutons made from cotton and layered according to traditional methods. These are not the cheap futon frames that Western college students buy from furniture stores, which are really just low sofas with foldable mattresses bolted to wooden or metal frames. These are the real thing. Flat cotton mats, typically 3 to 4 inches thick, designed to be placed directly on the floor, aired out on a balcony in the sun every few days, and stored in a closet when not in use. Online communities dedicated to floor sleeping have grown steadily over the past decade, with thousands of Westerners sharing their experiences transitioning away from traditional beds. The adjustment period usually lasts about 2 to 4 weeks. The first few nights are often uncomfortable as the body adapts to a firmer surface, but the people who stick with it consistently report deeper sleep, less morning stiffness, and the unexpected benefit of reclaiming an entire room's worth of living space. There is also a generational angle that has caught researchers off guard. Younger adults in Western cities, particularly those in expensive housing markets like San Francisco, New York, and London, have started adopting floor sleeping not out of spiritual curiosity, but out of practical necessity. When your studio apartment costs $2,000 a month and measures 300 square feet, the Japanese approach to space suddenly stops looking exotic and starts looking brilliant. So why do the Japanese sleep on the floor? The answer is not one thing, it is everything. It is 1,000 years of Buddhist philosophy that taught an entire civilization that simplicity is not deprivation but clarity. It is 7 centuries of samurai discipline that turned sleeping light and sleeping low into a survival advantage and then a cultural virtue. It is the geological reality of living on the most seismically active landmass on Earth, where heavy furniture kills people and light furnishings save them. It is the mathematical logic of tiny apartments where every square foot matters and a bed that cannot be stored is a permanent waste of space. It is the subtropical humidity that makes the floor the coolest, driest, most comfortable place to sleep for half the year. It is the daily physical practice of rising from the ground that keeps bodies limber and mobile well into old age. And it is the quiet confidence of a culture that watched the rest of the world choose a different path and decided, with full awareness of the alternative, that their way worked better. The real question is not why the Japanese sleep on the floor, it is why the rest of us stopped. If you found this one interesting, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, digging into the history and logic behind the things we take for granted. And if you want to see how another everyday habit has a hidden history most people never think about, that video is on screen now.